Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Cafe DC. I'm your host Faz Rahman, and this week we have a wonderful guest with us today here in the studios, and we'll just go right to her. Colonel Hussain, thank you very much for being with us. Before I get into the questioning and any serious conversation, let me just say that you're a wonderful example of multiculturalism, not just in the mainstream American society, but also in the U.S. Army. You are a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and you also served as a chaplain in one of a very prominent university here in the Boston area, right?
Yes,
And you tried to be a chaplain in the Army, but couldn't succeed.
correct.
What is a chaplain? What does it mean to be a chaplain? Please tell us about it.
Well, Faiz, it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
So a chaplain, it is a new terminology in the Muslim community. It's very old. It's a Christian word, and what a chaplain does is it's really being in presence with another human being. And there are a couple of settings, mostly in hospitals, university, and that's where I served at Tufts University, in the military and the prison system. And then there's this new concept called community chaplain, and that's the role I'm currently holding right now. And it's working within the masajids, the mosque, and working with the Muslim community.
Okay.
And a chaplain really is there to help people move through difficult times in their lives.
Okay. A lot of people, especially in the Muslim community here, they confuse a chaplain with an imam. Do you think that an imam is exactly like a chaplain, or there are some differences between these two roles?
Definitely, and that is, we are having that conversation within the Islamic chaplaincy in the United States, because if you are a man and you are a chaplain, automatically the community starts calling you imam. If you are a female and you're a chaplain, they're not sure what to call you, and they're not going to call me an imam or an imama. So there is a difference in the education that we receive. One of the critical element of the training is called clinical pastoral education, where you are trained to understand yourself before you could work with people. Most imams don't have that training, but it's a very important training for them to have, especially in the United States, where imams are becoming the everything all for the Muslim community.
Right.
So an imam's training is a little bit more in depth with the classical training, understanding Quran and Hadith in its depth, and leading the community in prayer and worship. But for a chaplain, it can be both. A chaplain can be an imam or a chaplain, but there is a unique difference.
You tried to be a chaplain in the Army, in the U.S. Army, and they didn't quite, look at it sympathetically, so to speak. They turned it down. What was the reason? Why do you think you cannot be a Muslim chaplain in the Army?
Well, the reason they gave me was if I were in the role of, they're seeing chaplain as / imam. As we know within Islam, I would not be able to lead the prayer for all men in the congregation. I can do it for all women. The military's logic was they would want me to lead the prayer for both men and women, like my male counterpart. However, there is that distinction within Islam. The prayer isn't the end-all or be-all. It doesn't matter who leads it.
What were your challenges there, being a chaplain at a prominent university, a Muslim chaplain, a woman Muslim chaplain?
I would say the difficulty is sort of shaping the environment and the conversation. If you have access to giving the khutbah or the sermon on the Fridays, you could share some important information to the community. Because I couldn't lead the prayer, the way that I solved the problem was to find imams or people that were willing to lead the prayer on Fridays. So I facilitated that process. So every Friday there was someone to lead the prayer. And then I also started to train the students. I thought it would be good training for them to also step up and also lead the prayer. So I would say the only disadvantage, I wasn't able to influence them from the pulpit, but I still made a difference in my counseling one-on-one with them, in my other community action, small colocas that we had. So, but Tufts was very happy to hire a Muslim female chaplain.
Colonel Sharida Hussain, allow me to call you Sharida from now on.
Okay.
Is it okay if I call you
perfectly.
Sharida? Okay.
Yes, no, please.
Sharida, your family came from Trinidad to the Boston area. And when they came as a young child, you were different. And as you grew up, you became kind of a rebel in the family, as I understood, reading a little bit of your bio. Now it turns out that you're a very traditional, conservative, hijab-wearing Muslim, and also serving as a reserve in the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel. Talk about this transformation. I mean, this is very interesting transformation, a change from being, a child to immigrants, somebody who wasn't very comfortable with the setting, and then, being so comfortable and so easy, and everything is working out very well for you. Please share some of those thoughts with us and with our audiences.
Yeah, so the rebel characteristic, I didn't realize I was a rebel until in my 30s. I just thought I was doing what normal people did living in the United States. So when I was 11, my parents came to the U.S. and they settled in the Boston area. Specifically, my parents wanted all their children to have access to higher education. And me being the first child, girl, and my brother's the second, if we had stayed in Trinidad, what would have happened. He would have been sent abroad. I would have been deprived of an education. So my mother and father made that choice. And I was privileged to go to a public elite school. You had to take an exam in the Boston area, Boston Latin Academy. And that school just...
Boston is, by the way, famous for good schools, colleges, universities.
It is.
It's a mecca of good universities and colleges.
Right, and my father realized that through watching Western movies. We watched Indian movies and Western movies, not American. We called it Western.
So you did watch Indian Bollywood movies?
Oh, I grew up with Bollywood movies.
And you still don't speak any Urdu?
And I still don't speak.
Or Hindi?
No. I understand a few words. My father understands it, but not me.
So Sharida, this all sounds very good. I do want to talk about talk about again the transformation that happened from being a rebel in the family to a hijab-wearing Muslim woman serving in the U.S. military, a reserve, Army Reserve. But before we do that, we have a report on women serving in the U.S. military.
Mr. Panetta's decision follows a recommendation from the nation's top generals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it surprised many Pentagon observers.
Female service members have faced the reality of combat, proven their willingness to fight, and yes, to die, to defend their fellow Americans.
The decision overturns a 1994 directive restricting women from combat roles. The military's senior officers were thought to be uneasy about opening the most physically demanding positions to women. Women's veterans organizations say it is about time the Pentagon caught up with the reality of the modern battlefield. They say women have been serving alongside men in de facto combat roles in Iraq and Afghanistan and receiving no credit for their accomplishments. Retired Air Force Brigadier General Wilma Vaught is president of the Women in Military Service for America Memorial Foundation.
Back in 1990-91, when we really recognized that the front line was no more, that, if you were in that type situation, combat was everywhere, and women were in it. And we had women in units that needed to be there. If the unit was going to deploy, women had to deploy with it.
But other veterans say this is a bad idea. Retired Army Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, now with the Conservative Family Research Council, says the decision puts unnecessary weight on commanders when they are trying to succeed at their mission and keep soldiers alive.
As a result of that, there's no privacy, there's no place for personal hygiene or other normal functions. And it puts a burden on commanders and leaders at every level to try and find some way to separate the sexes for those types of things.
Pentagon experts say lawmakers and civil rights advocates have pushed for a more inclusive military, and several women service members have sued the Pentagon, arguing that the combat ban is discriminatory. Brigadier General Vaught says the change gives women a chance at many command positions that require experience in combat units.
They have been denied promotion because they weren't eligible to be in some of these types of jobs. And there are certain type of jobs, if you aren't in those jobs, that you can't compete for other types of jobs.
The biggest change will be in the Army and Marine Corps, where 25% of active duty positions are closed to women. Jeff Swicord, VOA News, Washington.
And we'll get right back to the same question that I mentioned just before we watched this report. What happened? The transformation. And this is actually the question, it's a universal question. There are so many kids, not just here in this society, but also around the world, especially in Pakistan, battling with the same questions and ideas. So please share some of that stuff with us.
Yes, so I would say my daughter. It was time, she was 4 years old, getting ready to go to kindergarten, and my parents said they're going to take her to the mosque for Sunday school, where she would start learning about Islam, reading Quran, and so forth. And I realized, well, I'm the mother, I should be doing this. And it dawned upon me, I started to say, well, I'm in the military, I've been trained to take leadership roles, to be responsible. This is one of my duties I must be responsible with. So it started with me going back to the mosque. I sort of stayed away.
When you became a hijab-wearing woman serving in the U.S. military, so it was your family, your child.
It was my child.
That was the prime mover.
It was my child initially, and it was this community. And
a very sizable and strong community.
Very sizable and strong. A lot of Pakistani and Arabs. Those were the two largest populations here. And I wanted to lead by example. I still wasn't wearing hijab when I was functioning as a youth group advisor. And I felt if I'm trying to help these youth incorporate their faith, then I need to lead by example as my military characteristics.
So there were some terrible, terrible moments. I mean, when you must have felt sad and bad, being in the army, facing those challenges. And a lot of people who look at this, the army, the wars from outside, I mean, they just can't reconcile how come Muslims serving in the US Army can go into Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and with the right conscience still do their job. Can you please talk about it?
Yeah.
The conflicts, the clashes, internal, external, both.
Yeah, there are a lot of us have this question, this concern. And I would say before 9/11, it was easier to be in the military, sort of moving along in our careers. 9/11 was a very, very traumatic day in our history, and even more so, I think, for Muslims, because it was also, it felt for me, because I was Muslim, the terrorists were Muslim, that also my faith got attacked at the same time. And so I was in question. I've had conversations with my colleagues and what to do. And the way that I've reconciled it, I can't speak for others, but the way that I've reconciled it is I'm an American citizen. I have been in the military for these many years. It is part of a citizen of a country to support and defend its country, and that's the role that I've taken on as a soldier. And I felt 9/11, this is why I've been training. I need to stay, I need to defend my country, I need to protect my country. Granted, the question is then we are going overseas and killing Muslims.
9/11 basically was a watershed moment, just not for this country, the entire world, but more so for the Muslim community in this country.
Right, but I think for the Muslims in the military and myself, it was greater because A, we are a nation at war, and in my military community, I am now worried about body bags coming back, about families, about PTSD. I'm thinking about these things because my chaplaincy training started the second day of chaplaincy training at the seminary was 9/11. So this new career that I've taken on to serve and support people. So I'm thinking in my Muslim mind of serving the community. I'm thinking in my military mind that we are going to war. So it took me a long time to sort of reconcile all of this. And for Muslims, we've come to the conclusion we have to defend our country. We are serving in the armed forces, and that is our role and duty. And we are not seeing it in its simple form that we're killing Muslims. We are looking at it as we were attacked and we need to defend ourselves. And there are many countries that are Muslims are fighting Muslims, Iran and Iraq war. So I went beyond looking at it from that simple space and looking at it from a national nation. Where am I going to raise my children, my family? Which country am I in allegiance with? And there are many things that America has done that I may not agree with, and there are many things that other nations have done that I may not agree with. But within my service as a soldier in the military, that's how I've reconciled it.
How did you deal with the suspicion in your peers, your colleagues? There must have been lots of doubts on their minds, and you must have felt it. I mean, nobody could hide those doubts and suspicion. How did you deal with that?
Thank you. That is a very important question. And Muslims in the military, we have to be on hypervigilance and on our extra best behavior. And the way that I've dealt with it, and it was very interesting.
So you had to work twice as hard, be extra vigilant, extra cautious, just because you were being, because of your background
Yes.
and your religion?
Yes, yes. And at the same time, I felt it was also my duty and responsibility to help educate my colleagues about Islam, about Muslims, and not see Muslims as one monolithic community, but to see the diversity of Muslims. And my colleagues, because they knew me, initially it wasn't a threat. However, because we move from unit to unit and location to location, we always have to reprove ourselves with the new colleagues. So for many people in the military, every time they get to a new assignment, they have to now build the relationships again and reprove themselves to their colleagues. A month after 9/11, so I'm a reservist, meaning I go 1 week in a month, and then 2 weeks out of the year I'm in training. So this was a month after 9/11, I'm at my reserve duty, and my security officer came up to me and he said, Sharita, I'm not sure if you've thought about this, but people in the military may not trust you, and Muslims may not trust you as well in your community. And I was shocked. I didn't even think about the trust factor. And when he presenced that, I started to pay more attention to it. And there are, I can understand my American colleagues in the military why they may feel a little suspicious of me and angst. I do understand it. Do I like it? No. Do I understand it? Yes. And at the same time, we are in the military. There are rules and guidelines. If I break the law, by all means, I should be charged with whatever offense, and the law should take care of it. I shouldn't be presumed guilty before and then prove my innocence.
Did your superiors make an effort to make sure that you feel comfortable and you do your job properly, and the factor of distrust, angst, and suspicion aren't around when you're serving? I mean, were there efforts made consciously and properly?
I don't think they saw it as a need, because they are viewing me as a soldier, as a colleague. They're not even thinking or even aware that that could have been a concern. And when I've shared it with my colleagues or my bosses, it's like a novelty for them, because they're seeing.
It just hadn't occurred to them.
It hadn't occurred to them, and I'm just like them. However, I also was a higher ranking officer, and I'm more seasoned. I think where it affected the Muslims in the military, it's more the junior ranks, especially in the enlisted. And if they are in infantry combat type units, they got harassed a lot. And I've met individuals that have told me of their harassment. But they also brushed it off as a joke. So you call me towel head, camel jockey. I'm just going to, it will hurt me, but I'm not going to make a big to-do about it.
Great. We'll end this conversation on a different note, again, going back to some of the social issues that you faced, your family. Farhana was different, your daughter, because she was born here, right? And so she considered herself a total, absolute, full-blooded, so to speak, American. Did you see this, did you compare that contrast? I do that all the time myself, being an immigrant and then my children. So did you see that contrast, and do you think her being born here and being an American by birth, that made her job and her life easier?
I would say yes. And Farhana's father, so again, my rebel personality, I married a white American man when I was in the army stationed in Germany. And so Farhana's last name is Cannon. So Farhana Cannon, she feels part of the culture more so than I, and she feels like an American. She has inherited, I'd say, more of the Indian culture even than I, in the clothing.
So she loves Bollywood movies.
She does, and dresses in the traditional clothing more so than I. And so she has embodied both very easily. And she can flip in and out of accent from American to the Trinidad dialect much better than I. I've sort of trained myself to be that proper Bostonian, so I feel very American more than anything, but she embodies both. And so I'm very happy.
Yeah, that's a good point to consider. You remarried, and you married an Irish American, Jack.
Yes.
How that's going?
Well, yes. So I will be celebrating my 20th anniversary this year. Yeah, I'm very surprised too. He has been, I would say, my rock to allow me to be this self-expressed woman. Anything I want to do, he supports me wholeheartedly. He knows I'm in the military, and that was one of the agreements before I married him. I said, are you comfortable with me being in the military? I go away, I could go to war, I'll be away from you, can you live with that? And he has been most supportive to me. And I have learned a lot about, so he converted when we got married. He's a partial practicing Muslim, but his heart is a Muslim, and that to me is more importantly. I have learned how to live in an interfaith community, how to embody both Muslim, American culture, religions, and now what I do as a chaplain, I do a lot of interfaith
So
activities.
I guess you're just a walking outreach personality, huh? In your personal life, in your professional, so you're trying to basically make people understand, not just your husband, but also other people around you. What is, being like being a Muslim here.
Yes.
A Muslim, actually.
Yes, I do. And shortly after 9/11, so my transformation of wearing hijab happened in my mid-30s. And then 9/11 occurred, and my husband wanted...
So my daughters still have some time. All right, okay,
I think it is never too late ever in one's life.
Yes.
For anything.
Absolutely.
But when 9/11 occurred, my husband was very concerned for my safety. And he asked me to take my hijab off. And I said, this is one thing I cannot do right now. I need to know what my Muslim sisters are experiencing living in the United States. And I am amazed that when I'm in this uniform, the looks and the stares that I get normally, it's telling me, why don't you go back to the country you came from? And inside of me, I want to rip out my military ID and say, I'm defending you. And then when I'm in my military uniform, as you know, I can't wear my hijab yet. And people come up to me and thank me for serving my country. And so I live this dichotomy constantly. So I know what it is to be in my Muslim mind, I know what it is to be in my military mind, and I've done a lot of self-reflection, a lot of coaching and work to integrate and be at home and at peace in a not so peaceful world.
Colonel Sharida Hussain, thank you very much for this great conversation, this great insight, both into your personal and professional life. I thank you for being here. So this was our conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Sharida Hussain. A great story, a great inspiration. Thank you for watching, but please don't forget to send your comments and your feedback to cafedc@voanews.com. This is your host, Faz Rahman, thanking you once again.